Orion's cradle was not a beautiful place. It sat at the edge of the Valar system like an old boot left out in the rain, dented, patched in a dozen places, and held together by repairs that had been made on top of older repairs. The station had been running for 60 years, and it looked every single one of them. The walls were the color of old metal. The lights in the lower corridors flickered on a schedule that nobody had ever managed to fix. The air smelled like fuel and recycled oxygen, and the faint, strange odors of 100 different alien species passing through every week. But it worked. That was the thing about Orion's cradle. It was not pretty, and it was not comfortable, but it worked. Ships came in broken and left running. Cargo moved through on time. Fuel lines held. And a large part of the reason any of that was true came down to one man working in Bay 4 with grease on his hands and a diagnostic tool tucked behind his ear. Calvin Briggs had been a mechanic on Orion's cradle for 9 years. He was 34 years old, average height, with a lean build that came from spending most of his life crawling through tight spaces inside ship engines. His hair was dark brown and always slightly too long because he kept forgetting to cut it. He had calm brown eyes and the kind of face that people forgot quickly at first, but remembered later, usually because he had fixed something nobody else could figure out. Calvin was not loud. He did not tell stories at dinner or win arguments in the crew lounge. He was the kind of person who listened more than he spoke, who noticed things other people missed, and who could walk into a broken engine room and understand within minutes exactly what had gone wrong and why. He had a gift for machines the way some people had a gift for music. It was quiet and deep and completely natural to him. His closest friend on the station was Sarah Voss, a technician 3 years younger than him who handled the communication and docking systems for the upper bays. Sarah was quick and sharp and talked enough for both of them, which suited Calvin fine. They ate lunch together most days and had a running argument about the best way to seal a leaking fuel coupling that had been going on for 2 years without resolution. On the day everything changed, Calvin had been working since early morning on a cargo hauler in Bay 2. The job was finished by midday, and he was walking back through the main corridor toward Bay 4 when the docking alert came through. A Drakari vessel was requesting emergency clearance. Calvin stopped walking and looked up at the announcement board above the corridor junction. Around him, other crew members were doing the same. A few of the alien passengers waiting near the transit gates had gone very still. The Drakari were known everywhere. Every species with a ship and a star map knew who the Drakari were. They were ancient, a dragon species that had been traveling the galaxy for thousands of years before most other civilizations had discovered fire. They were large, scale, and carried themselves with the kind of quiet pride that made smaller species nervous. They did not often stop at stations like Orion's cradle. When they did, everyone noticed. Calvin watched through the wide observation window as the Drakari vessel came in. It was long and dark, with a hull that caught the light in shifting shades of deep red and black. Even damaged, and it was clearly damaged, trailing a thin line of vented gas from somewhere near its rear section, it looked extraordinary. The docking took longer than usual. The Drakari ship was a different class than the berths at Orion's cradle were designed for, and there was a tense 20 minutes of slow maneuvering before it was locked in at Bay 7. Calvin watched a little longer than he needed to, then went back to work. He was replacing a pressure valve in Bay 4 when Sarah's voice came over his earpiece. "You watching Bay 7?" she said. "Not right now," Calvin said. "The Drakari crew came off, 12 of them. They look unhappy." "Drakari always look unhappy." "Fair point," Sarah said. "Their ship's in bad shape, though. Fuel line issue near the aft coupling. Sound familiar to anyone?" Calvin almost smiled. "I'll go look at it after shift." "Commander Drakal already assigned the Bay 7 crew." "Then they'll handle it." He went back to the valve. The next hour passed quietly. Then the alarm went off. It was not a drill alarm. Calvin knew the difference. The drill alarm had a pause in it, a small hesitation built into the tone so crew members would not panic. This alarm was straight and constant and very loud, and it was coming from the direction of Bay 7. Calvin was already moving before the announcement came through. Fire in Docking Bay 7. All personnel evacuate the lower east corridor. Fire in Docking Bay 7. The corridor filled fast. Crew members, station workers, alien passengers. Everyone was moving in the same direction, away from Bay 7. Calvin moved with them for a moment, checking faces, making sure people knew where to go. He saw two younger technicians who looked lost and pointed them toward the emergency stairwell. He saw an alien trader struggling with a heavy bag and told the person to leave it. He kept moving, checking, directing. The smoke reached the corridor before he made it to the junction. It was thick and dark, carrying the sharp chemical smell of burning fuel and something else beneath it, something hot and metallic from the Drakari ship itself. Calvin stopped at the junction. The evacuation flow was moving to his left. Bay 7 was to his right. He was about to turn left. Then he heard it. It was small, barely audible under the alarm and the noise of running feet and the deep crackling of the fire from somewhere beyond the sealed bay doors. It was high and thin and desperate, and it was coming from inside Bay 7. Calvin stood very still for 1 second. It sounded like a child crying. He turned right. He did not run. He walked, fast and deliberate, the way he moved when he was walking toward a problem he already knew he was going to fix. He reached the Bay 7 access door and checked the panel beside it. The door was sealed but not yet locked into emergency mode. He had 30 seconds, maybe less. He pulled out his access card, pressed it to the reader, and went in. The heat hit him like a wall. Behind him, the door sealed shut. The first thing Calvin noticed was the noise. Fire was not quiet. He had known that in an abstract way before, the way a person knows things they have read but never experienced. But standing inside Bay 7 with the door sealed behind him, he understood it in a completely different way. The fire was alive with sound, a deep, constant roaring that filled the entire space and pressed against his ears like something physical. Below it, metal groaned and popped as the heat worked its way through the structure of the Drakari vessel. Somewhere deeper inside, something hissed and crackled in a way that told Calvin a secondary fuel line had already gone. The bay was enormous, and the Drakari ship took up most of it. The fire had started near the aft section, the rear of the ship, and was moving forward along the fuel lines the way fire always did when it found something to follow. The left side of the bay was already lost. Thick black smoke rolled across the ceiling like a slow wave, dropping lower every minute. Calvin pulled his work jacket up over his nose and mouth and assessed. He was good at this. Not at fires specifically, but at walking into a broken situation and reading it quickly. He did it with engines every day. Walk in, look, understand, decide. He used the same process now. He could not go left. The floor near the aft coupling had already buckled, and there was open flame running along the wall. He could not go around the outside of the ship because the gap between the hull and the bay wall was choked with debris from the initial rupture. He had to go through the ship. Calvin moved to the Drakari vessel's side entry port, which was still open from when the crew had evacuated. He climbed up and went in. Inside, the ship was dim and strange. Everything was built large. Corridors wide enough for beings twice Calvin's size, with low lighting that ran along the floor in deep amber lines. The smoke was thinner in here than in the bay, but it was present, drifting through from somewhere ahead. The floor vibrated faintly under his boots. The heat was everywhere, pressing in from the walls on both sides. Calvin moved forward, listening. The crying sound was harder to track inside the ship. The walls carried noise in odd ways, bouncing it and folding it until direction became difficult. He stopped at a corridor junction and went completely still, breathing slowly through his jacket, waiting. There, to the right and down. He followed it. The corridor sloped downward toward what Calvin guessed was a lower crew deck. The amber floor lighting here was flickering badly, blinking on and off in a pattern that meant the power systems were already failing. He moved carefully, testing the floor ahead of him with each step before putting his full weight down. A ship losing structural integrity from heat could give way without warning, and he had no interest in falling through a floor in the middle of a burning alien vessel. The crying grew louder. He found her behind a sealed interior door at the end of the lower corridor. The door had a manual release, a large lever on the left side, clearly designed for a hand much bigger than Calvin's. He gripped it with both hands, braced his boot against the wall beside it, and pulled hard. The lever gave with a grinding resistance, and the door swung open. The room beyond was small by Drakari standards. It was some kind of rest area, low, curved surfaces along the walls that served as sleeping platforms. A few objects scattered on the floor that Calvin did not recognize. A support beam had come down from the ceiling, angled across the center of the room, its far end resting on the floor near the back wall. Pinned beneath it, in the corner, was the hatchling. Calvin had expected something that looked frightening. He was not sure why, perhaps because the Drakari adults were so large and carried such weight in the way they moved. But the hatchling was small. She was roughly the size of a large dog, with pale silver scales that caught the flickering light and threw it back in tiny, scattered pieces. Her wings were folded tight against her body. Her eyes were enormous and gold, and they were fixed on Calvin with an expression that crossed every species boundary he had ever encountered. She was terrified, and she was alone, and she was crying. "Okay," Calvin said quietly. He said it the way he always started difficult jobs, simply to himself, settling into the work. "Okay, let's see what we have here." He moved to the beam. It was heavy. He could see that before he even touched it. Drakari construction used dense materials, and this beam was thick and solid. Lifting it straight up was not going to happen, but it was angled, which meant it had a pivot point. Calvin crouched and studied the geometry of it for a moment, the way it rested against the floor, the direction of the angle, where the weight was concentrated. He found a length of metal rod near the wall, part of something that had fallen earlier, and wedged it under the beam at the point where the leverage would be best. Then he pushed down on the rod with everything he had. The beam shifted. Not much, but enough. The hatchling pulled her pinned leg free and scrambled backward against the wall, watching Calvin with those wide, gold eyes. Calvin let the beam down slowly and straightened up. His hands were shaking slightly from the effort. He looked at the hatchling and kept his voice very calm. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "We need to leave." She did not move. Calvin crouched down so he was lower, smaller, less threatening, and held out one hand, palm up, the way he did when a stray had wandered into the maintenance bay back on his first station posting. He waited. The hatchling looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face. Then, slowly, she moved forward and pressed her nose against his palm. Her scales were very warm. Calvin carefully wrapped her in his heavy, fireproof mechanic's jacket, leaving space for her head, and lifted her against his chest. She was heavier than she looked. She stopped crying. He turned back toward the corridor. The way out was already worse than the way in. The smoke in the lower corridor had thickened considerably, and when Calvin reached the junction and looked up toward the main corridor, he could see the ceiling above had changed color. The paint was blistering and dark, which meant the temperature up there had climbed significantly while he was below. He moved fast and low, the hatchling held close, one arm curved around her and one hand trailing the wall for guidance when visibility dropped to almost nothing. He counted the doorways he passed to keep his position, 3, 4, 5, and turned at the 5th the way he had come in. The exit port was still open. Calvin climbed through, dropped into the bay below, landed hard, and kept moving. The left side of the bay was fully involved now, and the heat coming from that direction was extraordinary. He angled right, toward the access door, staying as close to the far wall as the debris allowed. A section of ceiling panel gave way above him without any warning. It caught his left shoulder and arm on the way down, heavy and hot, and knocked him sideways into the wall. He did not drop the hatchling. He hit the wall with his right side and stayed upright, though his left arm immediately stopped working properly, and the pain arrived a moment later, deep and serious. He did not stop moving. The access door panel was still reading active. He pressed his card against it with his right hand, the hatchling balanced against his chest, his left arm hanging in a way he decided not to look at. The door opened. Calvin walked through into the corridor. The air outside was cool by comparison and hit him like cold water. He took 3 steps, then 4, then stopped because his legs had decided that was enough for now. He leaned against the corridor wall and slid down it slowly until he was sitting on the floor, the hatchling still bundled in his jacket against his chest. The corridor was empty. Everyone had evacuated. Then he heard footsteps running toward him, and Sarah's voice, loud and cracked in a way he had never heard from her before. "Calvin! Calvin!" He looked up. She stopped a few feet away and stared at him, at the state of his arm, at the smoke coming off his jacket, at the small silver head poking out from the bundle against his chest. "I found her," Calvin said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. Sarah pressed both hands over her mouth. Behind her, through the observation window at the corridor's end, Calvin could see the Drakari crew standing on the outer platform in a line, completely still and completely silent. One of them, older, larger than the rest, with darker scales along her neck and shoulders, was not looking at the fire. She was looking directly at Calvin, and even from that distance, even through the thick observation glass, her expression was something Calvin could not name, something between disbelief and a recognition so deep it looked almost like grief. The medical bay on Orion's Cradle was not built for drama. It was a small, practical room with white walls, 2 treatment beds, a shelf of medical supplies arranged in alphabetical order, and a ceiling light that hummed at a frequency that most patients found mildly irritating. The station's medical officer, a quiet man named Dr. Paul Hensley, had worked in that room for 11 years and had treated everything from broken fingers to radiation burns to the particular kind of exhaustion that came from working double shifts for 3 weeks straight. He had never treated burns quite like Calvin's. The left arm and shoulder were the worst of it. The ceiling panel that had come down in the bay had been hot enough to do serious damage through Calvin's jacket, and Dr. Hensley worked steadily and without conversation for a long time, cleaning and treating and wrapping with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that words were not useful right now. Calvin sat on the treatment bed and let him work, his eyes slightly unfocused, his right hand resting on the edge of the bed. Sarah sat in the chair beside the door. She had not left. She had tried to talk twice and both times found that nothing she planned to say came out correctly, so she had stopped trying and was simply present, which was what Calvin would have done for her, and she knew it. Kial had been taken, gently and carefully, by Vithara, the older Drakari female who had been watching through the observation window. The hatchling had not wanted to go. She had made a sound when they separated her from Calvin, a short and unhappy sound that carried through the corridor walls and made 2 passing crew members stop and look around in confusion. But Vithara had been patient and calm, and eventually Kial had gone with her, though she had looked back at the medical bay door 3 times. Now Vithara stood outside that door. She had been standing there since Calvin was brought in. She had not asked to enter. She had not spoken to anyone. She simply stood in the corridor with her arms folded and her dark eyes forward, and the 2 crew members who had initially considered asking her to move had looked at her more carefully and then decided not to. Sarah stepped outside once, mostly because she felt someone should acknowledge the situation. "He's going to be all right," she said. "Dr. Hensley says the burns are serious but treatable. He'll have full use of the arm." Vithara looked at her. "I know he will be all right," she said. Her voice was deep and measured, accented in a way that suggested she had learned the common tongue long ago and had learned it very well. "I am not waiting because I am concerned about his survival." Sarah blinked. "Then why are you waiting?" Vithara was quiet for a moment. "Because what happened today has not happened before," she said. "Not in any record I have read, and I do not yet know how to explain it to him. I am thinking about the correct words." Sarah looked at her for a moment longer, then went back inside and sat down and did not bring it up with Calvin because she could tell from his face that he was not ready for more information yet. Calvin slept for several hours after Dr. Hensley finished. When he woke, the medical bay was quieter. The ceiling light still hummed. His left arm was wrapped from wrist to shoulder and elevated on a support frame. The pain had settled into a deep, constant ache that was unpleasant, but manageable. Vithara was standing beside his bed. Calvin looked at her for a moment without speaking. She was large, nearly twice his height, with scales the color of deep charcoal along her back and neck, fading to a lighter gray at her jaw and throat. Her eyes were amber, sharp, and very calm. She held herself with the particular stillness of someone who had been still for a very long time and was comfortable with it. "You are awake," she said. "Yes," Calvin said. "How is the pain?" "There," Calvin said. "Not unmanageable." Vithara nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had expected. Then she was quiet for a moment, and Calvin had the impression she was choosing her next words with great care. "The hatchling's name is Kial," she said. "She is the only surviving child of the Drakari High Speaker. His name is Oranthos. He leads our people, politically, spiritually, in all matters of consequence. Kial was not meant to be on the vessel. No member of the crew knew she had come aboard. She followed a junior attendant up the boarding ramp during loading and found her way to the lower rest deck before anyone noticed she was missing." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "Is she all right?" "She is physically unharmed," Vithara said. "Because of you." Calvin said nothing. He had the sense that Vithara was building towards something and that it was better to let her build. "In our culture," Vithara continued, "there is something very old, older than our current records, though the records of it go back many thousands of years. It is called the Mirandath. The direct translation into your language would be something close to the flame witness mark." She paused. "When a hatchling is pulled from fire by another living being, carried through flame, protected through flame, something happens. It is not symbolic, it is not ceremonial. It simply occurs, and it has always occurred. And in all of our recorded history, we have never fully understood why. A mark appears on the one who carried the hatchling. It cannot be given. It cannot be created by any process we know of. It arrives on its own." Calvin looked at her. Then he looked down at his right arm, the one that had not been burned. He had not noticed it before. He had been focused on the pain in his left arm from the moment he came out of the bay, and then on Dr. Hensley's work, and then on sleep. But it was there. Running from his right wrist to the inside of his elbow, clear and vivid against his skin, was a pattern of markings. They were the color of silver, a bright, cool silver that caught the light the way Kial's scales had caught it in the burning room. The shape of them was like rising flames, thin and precise, following the line of his arm in a way that looked purposeful and old. He stared at it for a long time. "I didn't have that before," he said. "No," Vithara said. "You did not." Calvin touched the markings carefully with one finger. They did not hurt. They did not feel raised or raw the way a burn would. They felt like skin, his skin, as though they had always been there. "What does it mean?" he asked. Vithara straightened slightly. "It means that Kial has bonded to you, not by choice. She is too young to make that choice consciously. But the bond has formed regardless. In our law, in our history, in every tradition we carry, you are now recognized as a guardian of a Drakari hatchling." She paused again. "Your name will be known to every Drakari alive. The High Speaker must be told, and he will require you to come to our home world." The ceiling light hummed. Calvin looked at the silver marks on his arm for another long moment. "I just went in because I heard her crying," he said. Vithara's expression shifted. It was subtle, a change in the set of her jaw, something in her eyes that softened for just a moment before returning to stillness. "I know," she said quietly. "That is exactly why the mark appeared." Outside the medical bay door, just visible through the narrow window, Kial was sitting in the corridor. She was facing the door. She had been sitting there, Sarah would later tell Calvin, since the moment he had woken up. Waiting, in the particular patient way of someone who simply knew that the person on the other side of the door was there and was going to be all right. Calvin looked at her through the window for a moment. Then he looked back at Vithara. "When do we leave?" he said. Draarus Prime was not what Calvin had expected. He was not entirely sure what he had expected. Something harsh, perhaps. Something that matched the reputation of the species that lived there, ancient and proud and not particularly interested in beings smaller than themselves. He had imagined dark skies and sharp mountains and a general atmosphere of being unwelcome. What he found was something that stopped him at the top of the landing ramp and made him stand still for a moment longer than he intended. The planet was extraordinary. The mountains were there, yes, enormous ranges of dark volcanic rock that rose in long, jagged lines against a sky that was deeper and more vivid than any sky Calvin had seen before. A color somewhere between amber and red that came from the particular composition of the atmosphere and the angle of the star this planet circled. The cities were carved directly into the rock faces, tier after tier of dark stone architecture rising hundreds of meters, lit from within by fire. Actual fire, running in channels and grooves through the stone the way water ran through pipes on other worlds. From a distance, the cities looked like they were breathing, the firelight shifting and moving behind thousands of open windows and walkways. It was enormous, it was ancient, and it was, in its own severe way, deeply beautiful. Calvin stood at the top of the ramp and looked at it. Kial pressed her nose against the back of his good hand and made a small sound. "Yeah," Calvin said quietly, "I see it." Vithara had arranged for a human diplomat to meet them at the landing platform, a practical decision, since Calvin was going to need someone who understood both the political situation and the translation gaps that would arise in the formal hearing. The diplomat's name was Lenny Adler, and she was waiting at the base of the ramp when they came down. She was a woman in her mid-40s, composed and professional, with sharp eyes that did a quick assessment of Calvin the moment she saw him, taking in the wrapped arm, the silver marks visible below the sleeve of his jacket, the hatchling walking close beside his leg, and arrived at some set of conclusions that she kept to herself. "Calvin Briggs," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Lenny Adler. I've been briefed on the situation." "All of it?" Calvin said. "Enough of it," she said. "The hearing is tomorrow morning. Tonight you rest. I'll walk you through the protocol this evening so you know what to expect." She glanced at Kial. "She stays close to you?" "She does," Calvin said. Lenny nodded as if this was simply another piece of information to work with and turned to lead them toward the city. That evening, in the guest quarters carved into the lower tier of the city, rooms built for human visitors that were sparse but thoughtful, with furniture at the right height and a window that looked out over the fire channels below, Len sat across from Calvin and explained what was going to happen. The hearing was formal. The full Elder Council of the Drakari would be present, seated in a chamber that had been used for significant decisions for over 4,000 years. Calvin would stand at the center. He would be asked to state his name and his origin. Then High Speaker Oranthus would speak, and then the council members would speak, and Calvin should not interrupt any of them regardless of what they said. "Some of them are not going to be happy about this," Len said directly. "I want you to know that before you walk in so it doesn't surprise you. The Mirandath appearing on a non-Drakari being, it has simply never happened. There are council members who believe it cannot be legitimate. They will say so." "What do I do when they say so?" Calvin asked. "Nothing," Lena said. "You stand there. You let them speak. And if Oranthos asks you a direct question, you answer it honestly and simply. Don't try to be diplomatic. Don't try to say what you think they want to hear. Just answer what is true." Calvin looked at the fire channel outside the window for a moment. "All right," he said. Lena looked at him with an expression that was not quite sympathy, but was something adjacent to it. "You went into a burning ship for a hatchling you had never met," she said. "You don't need to be anything in that chamber other than exactly what you already are." Calvin did not answer that, but he thought about it for a long time after she left. The hearing chamber was everything the rest of the city suggested it would be. It was cut from a single enormous section of volcanic rock, the ceiling lost in shadow high above, the walls lined with fire channels that ran in slow, even lines from floor to ceiling. The floor was black stone, polished smooth over thousands of years of use. The council seated themselves on tiered platforms that rose in a semicircle around the central floor space, 15 elder Drakari in total, each of them old and large, and carrying the particular weight of beings who had been consequential for a very long time. Oranthos sat at the center of the highest tier. He was larger than Vithara, larger than any Drakari Calvin had seen so far, which was already an adjustment. His scales were a deep, layered black with traces of dark red along the ridge lines, the kind of coloring that came with extreme age in the Drakari. His eyes were the color of copper, and they settled on Calvin the moment he entered the chamber and did not move from him. Calvin walked to the center of the floor. Kial walked beside him. Vithara had told him that morning that there was no precedent for how to handle Kial's presence in the chamber, and therefore no rule against it, and therefore she would come. The chamber was very quiet. 3 council members spoke against the mark's validity before Oranthos said anything. They were measured in their language but clear in their meaning. A human could not carry the Marandath. It was a Drakari bond. It belonged to Drakari tradition. The mark, whatever it was, must have another explanation. Calvin stood and listened. He kept his expression neutral. Lene, standing at the edge of the chamber, caught his eye once and gave a small nod. Then Oranthos spoke, and everyone else went silent. He did not address the council. He addressed Calvin directly in the common tongue, his voice filling the chamber without effort. "Tell me your name and where you come from." "Calvin Briggs," Calvin said. "I'm a mechanic. I work at a refueling station called Orion's Cradle in the Valar system." Oranthos looked at him steadily. "Tell me why you entered the fire." The chamber was completely still. Calvin thought about the question for a moment, not because he was unsure of the answer, but because he wanted to say it correctly. "I heard her crying," he said. "I knew the layout of the ship well enough to have a reasonable chance of getting to her, so I went in." Silence. Then, from beside Calvin's left leg, Kial walked forward 3 steps across the black stone floor, turned, walked back, and sat down directly on top of Calvin's boots. She settled there with the complete confidence of a creature who had decided where she belonged and saw no reason to discuss it further. Something shifted in the chamber. Calvin could feel it without being able to name it exactly, like a change in air pressure, or the moment in a stalled engine when the right component finally seated correctly and everything aligned. One of the council members who had spoken against the mark said nothing further. None of them did. Oranthos looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he looked at Calvin again. "The Marandath does not make errors," he said. It was not directed at Calvin. It was directed at the chamber. Then, more quietly to Calvin alone, "She chose correctly." The hearing continued for another hour, covering questions of law and tradition, and what Calvin's status would mean in practical terms going forward. Calvin answered what he was asked and stayed quiet when he was not. Lena handled the formal procedural parts with steady competence. By the time they walked out of the chamber and back into the amber light of Draarus Prime, Calvin's name had been accepted into the Drakari fire archives. His status as Kial's guardian was formally recognized, and Oranthos had delivered one final piece of information that Lena translated carefully on the walk back. Kial's bond was still forming. It would take time to stabilize. Months, not weeks. Until it did, she needed to remain near Calvin. Calvin walked in silence for a moment, Kial moving beside him, the fire channels glowing warm along the city walls around them. "So she's coming back to the station with me," he said. "Yes," Lene said. Calvin looked down at Kial. She looked up at him with her gold eyes, calm and certain. "All right," he said. Life on Orion's Cradle changed in ways that were small at first and then impossible to ignore. It started with the sounds. Kial was a curious creature, and curiosity in a dragon hatchling expressed itself through constant movement and occasional accidents. She followed Calvin through every corridor, every maintenance bay, every access tunnel he crawled into for work. She sat beside his tool bag when he worked on engines and watched his hands with the focused attention of a student who understood that something important was being demonstrated, even if the specific lesson was not yet clear. When he reached for a tool, she tracked the movement. When something made a sound she did not recognize, her head tilted to one side and her nostrils flared, and she stored the information away with great seriousness. She also, on 3 separate occasions in the first 2 weeks, chewed through electrical cabling. Not out of malice. Calvin was fairly certain she was attracted to the faint vibration that active cables carried, the low hum of current that ran through the walls and floors of the station like a slow pulse. She could feel it in a way that he could not, and it interested her. He discovered the first incident when a lighting circuit in Corridor 7 went dark, and the diagnostic led him to a section of cable that had been neatly bitten in half. He discovered the second when Sarah's communication panel in the upper bay lost power mid-conversation with an incoming cargo vessel. He discovered the third before it became a problem, because he had by that point developed a sense for when Kial had gone quiet in a way that suggested she was investigating something she probably should not. He began carrying spare cable in his tool bag. Sarah adapted with the particular flexibility of someone who had always handled unexpected situations well. She started keeping a written record of Kial's developments, a small notebook that she carried in her jacket pocket and added to most days. She did not think of it as official documentation. She thought of it as something she was doing for her own understanding, because what was happening around her was genuinely without precedent, and she wanted to remember it accurately. The notebook entries in the first month included things like, ate half of Calvin's lunch today and showed no interest in the other half. Learned that the docking alarm means loud noise is coming and positions herself in doorways when she hears it. Made a sound today that the alien trader from the Vel system recognized and visibly reacted to. He stood straighter and moved aside when she passed, which she seemed to expect. That last observation was the one Sarah found most interesting. The station's population was changing in its relationship with Kial, and by extension with Calvin, in ways that were subtle but consistent. Species that had always treated the human maintenance crew as a functional but unremarkable part of the station's operation began to notice Calvin in a different way. Not loudly, not with ceremony, but a Drakari mark was a known thing across many cultures, and the silver flame markings on Calvin's right arm were visible when he worked with his sleeves rolled up, which was most of the time. Beings who recognized what they were seeing would look at the marks, then look at Calvin, then look at Kial, and recalibrate something in their understanding. An elder merchant from a species called the Varesi, who had been coming through Orion's Cradle for 20 years and had never once spoken to any human crew member beyond the necessary transactional exchanges, stopped Calvin in the main corridor one afternoon and stood in front of him for a moment without speaking. Then she inclined her head, a deep, formal inclination that Calvin recognized as significant without knowing exactly why, and walked on without a word. Calvin mentioned it to Vithara that evening. Vithara had remained at the station as Kial's official Drakari attendant. She had taken up quarters near the docking section and had established a routine that included morning checks on Kial, regular communication with Draarus Prime, and occasional long conversations with Calvin in the maintenance bay while he worked. The conversations had developed slowly, the way conversations did between two people who were both more comfortable with silence than with talk. They had arrived, over weeks, at something that felt like genuine ease. "The Varesi have long memory," Vithara said when Calvin described the merchant's gesture. "They remember things that other species have stopped recording. That inclination she gave you, it is a form of recognition they reserve for those they consider to carry significance." "I'm a mechanic," Calvin said. "You are a flame witness," Vithara said. "These are not contradictory." Calvin thought about that while he finished the seal he was working on. Kial, who had been asleep on the heated mat that Vithara had installed along the far wall of the maintenance bay, opened one gold eye, observed that nothing of immediate interest was happening, and went back to sleep. 3 months after the fire, on an ordinary afternoon with no particular significance attached to it, A Drakari vessel docked at Bay 3 for refueling. It was a standard procedure, handled by the Bay 3 crew without incident. Calvin was working in Bay 4 and was aware of it only in the background way that he was always aware of docking activity. He did not know that Orinthos was on the vessel until Vithara appeared in the maintenance bay doorway and told him quietly that the High Speaker would like to visit, if Calvin had no objection. Calvin looked up from the coupling he was resealing. He was sitting on the floor with his legs crossed and his tool bag open beside him, his jacket off because the bay ran warm. The silver marks on his right arm caught the light as he moved. "Right now?" Calvin said. "Yes," Vithara said. There was something in her expression that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "Tell him to come in," Calvin said, and went back to the coupling. Orinthos entered Bay 4 a few minutes later. He was enormous in the space. The ceiling clearance was sufficient but only just, and his presence changed the dimensions of the room in a way that was difficult to quantify but immediately felt. He stood near the entrance for a moment and looked at the bay, at the organized tool racks, at the engine components laid out in careful sequence on the work table, at Kial asleep on her mat in the corner. And then he walked to where Calvin was sitting on the floor and stood nearby. Calvin looked up at him. "You can sit if you want," Calvin said, gesturing at the floor space beside him. "It won't be comfortable, but there's room." Oranthus looked at the floor. Then he folded himself down and sat, which involved a considerable rearrangement of his considerable frame, and the result was not elegant, but it was genuine. He sat beside Calvin on the floor of Bay 4 and said nothing for a while. Calvin went back to the coupling. They stayed like that for several minutes, Calvin working, Oranthus watching, while the sounds of the station moved around them and Kial breathed slowly in her sleep in the corner. Then Oranthus spoke. "During your hearing," he said, "several phrases were spoken by the council in our language that were not translated for you. I asked Vithara to leave one of them untranslated. I wanted to deliver it myself." Calvin stopped working and looked at him. Oranthus met his eyes directly. "The phrase was spoken by the oldest member of our council. She has seen more years than most beings in this part of the galaxy. She spoke it when Kial sat on your feet." He was quiet for a moment. "The phrase is, Tarath Maran Deth Va'al. The closest translation in your language is this: fire does not mark those it does not recognize." The bay was quiet. Calvin looked at the silver marks on his right arm for a moment. He had stopped noticing them in daily life the way a person stopped noticing a familiar scar. But he noticed them now. He thought about the corridor outside Bay 7, the alarm, the direction he had chosen to turn, the small crying sound that had been barely audible under everything else. He thought about how it had not felt like a decision at the time. It had felt like the most straightforward thing in the world. A child was in there and he knew the way in, and so he had gone. He looked up at Orinthos. "Thank you for telling me," he said. Orinthos nodded once. Then he looked at Kial in the corner. She had woken up at some point during the conversation, quietly, the way she sometimes did without making a sound. She was sitting up on her mat with her gold eyes open, looking at her father with an expression that was calm and settled and completely without anxiety. She was exactly where she wanted to be. She had known it since a burning corridor on a broken ship, when a pair of steady hands had reached under a fallen beam and a quiet voice had said, "We need to leave," and the whole world had reorganized itself around that simple fact. Oranthus looked at his daughter for a long time. Something moved across his expression, deep and private, the kind of feeling that old beings carry carefully because they have learned how heavy it can become if not handled with care. Then he looked back at Calvin, and what he said next he said in a voice low enough that it was meant only for the two of them and the quiet bay around them. "She chose well," he said. Cal did not answer, but he held the words and felt the weight of them. Not heavy in a burdensome way, but solid, the way a well-made thing feels solid when you hold it in your hand. He went back to work. Kial watched him with her gold eyes, smoke drifting in a thin, gentle line from her nose, content in the particular deep way of a creature who has found exactly where it belongs and has no intention of being anywhere else. and in the fire archives on Draarus Prime, carved in silver into obsidian stone that had held names for 10,000 years, the newest entry remained exactly as it had been written on the day the Council accepted it. Simple and plain and permanent, the way true things tended to be. Calvin Briggs, Flame Witness, Guardian of Kial of the High House. And below it, in the smallest script the tradition allowed, a single note in the common tongue, so that any being from any world who read the archives would understand it without translation.
He heard her crying.
He knew the way.